Chapter 45. Wigs and Makeup. As they stepped out of the changing room, Jack and his grandfather made an unlikely pair of nurses. The boy was unusually short, and there wasn't time for Grandpa to shave off his bushy moustache. The changing room was situated in the back of the old folks' home and had a long rail of nurses' uniforms. Jack and Grandpa had hastily grabbed a couple and put them over their own clothes. At the far end of the changing rooms stood a tall mirror and a table with a selection of wigs and a big box of makeup, which Jack and his grandfather had raided. Grandpa had become a blonde bombshell, his grandson a sultry brunette. The boy was right. The nurses were clearly all men in disguise. Twilight Towers was certainly no ordinary old folks' home. Each time you peeled off a layer, it became stranger and stranger. As they tottered down the corridor, a group of nurses bundled past, charging towards the front door. Grandpa nodded to Jack that they should join them. Their only chance of escape now was to try and blend in with the staff. They had to pray that they would not get stopped as they made their way along the labyrinth of corridors towards freedom. As the nurses reached the front door, Grandpa and Jack followed a short distance behind, but just as they were about to escape out in the dark, a voice bellowed, "Stop!" All the nurses turned round to see Matron standing behind them, still wielding her souped-up cattle prod. Nurses Daisy and Blossom were flanking her. These two now had their wigs on back to front, and they both looked even more ridiculous than before. Matron approached her army of nurses, slowly, gently, tapping the palm of her hand with her instrument of torture. As discreetly as they could, Jack and his grandfather shuffled themselves to the back of the group so as not to be seen by her. The rest of the inmates seemed to have got away for now, but the two ringleaders of tonight's breakout are still here in Twilight Towers. "I'm sure of it," Miss Swine announced. "I can feel it in my bones, and they're the ones who must not escape." "Yes, Matron," came a chorus of voices, all far too deep to be women. "My orders are for you all to split up into pairs and search every last nook and cranny of this building until you find them. If you fail, I will turn my cattle prod on you." "Yes, Matron." Despite all the nurses being big, strong men, it was clear they lived in mortal fear of their boss. With great authority, she barked further orders to her troops. "Nurses, Tulip, Hyacinth, search the dormitories." "Yes, Matron," they answered before marching off towards the stairs. "Nurses Violet and Pansy, you two search this floor, the living room, the kitchen, everywhere." "Yes, Matron," replied the next pair before they marched off too. "Nurses Daisy and Blossom." "Yes, Matron," they answered in unison. "You can search the basement." "But I'm afraid of the dark," complained Nurse Daisy. Miss Swine's face contorted in displeasure. She was not used to having her orders disobeyed. She slapped the palm of her hand hard with her cattle prod. "You will do as I say." "Yes, Matron," replied the nervy nurse, now trembling in fear. The pair headed off. That left Matron alone in the corridor with her newest nurses, Jack and Grandpa. "As for you," Miss Swine was looking straight at them. The pair had nowhere to hide behind now. The boy was standing on his tiptoes in an attempt to look taller. Meanwhile, his grandfather was covering his moustache with his hands and pretending to cough. "I haven't seen you two here before. Who are you?" demanded Miss Swine. Jack put on his deepest voice. "Nurses Matron." "What are your names?" The pair had to think fast, as if they would not get busted. "Nurse Bluebell," replied Jack. "And Nurse Graham," said Grandpa, forgetting he was meant to choose a girl's name. Jack gently jabbed him with his elbow. "I mean, Gardenia." Slowly and calmly, Matron approached them. Both instinctively put their heads down in a desperate attempt not to be recognised. This made Matron even more suspicious. Still tapping the prod in her hand, she stepped closer and closer. "Take your hand away from your face," she said to the old man. Grandpa pretended to cough again. Bit of a cough coming on. The lady brought her hand up to ease. She held on to it tight, digging her long, sharp nails into his skin. Then, with considerable force, she pulled his hand down from his face, revealing his RAF standard issue moustache. Just forgot to pluck today, Grandpa said. Needless to say, Matron was not convinced. Slowly but surely, she brought up her prod and moved it towards the old man's face. As she did, so a bolt of electricity shot out the other end. Grandpa gulped in terror. Oh. Chapter 46. Burned Moustache. Excuse me, I just need to use the convenience, announced Mrs. Trifle. Just at that moment. As she spoke, she strode in through the front door behind Grandpa and Jack. Instead of escaping over the wall with all the other inmates, it seemed the old lady had done a U-turn and waltzed straight back into Twilight Towers in search of the loo. This was certainly not part of the plan, but it proved an excellent diversion just when Jack and his grandfather desperately needed one. Miss Swine turned her head to see Miss Trifle. Mrs. Trifle breezed through the front door. With Matron's cattle prod inches from his face, Grandpa seized the opportunity and grabbed the woman's wrist. For a moment, the two were locked in a silent wrestle. The lady was much stronger than the old man could ever be, and could have ever imagined. And in the end of the prod moved closer and closer to his face. Suddenly, a bolt of electricity shot out. Zap! It burned one end of his moustache off. In a fizzle of flames, a small plume of grey smoke rose past Grandpa's eyes. He looked down at his once magnificent facial hair. Now one side was nothing more than a blackened tip, like a sausage that had been left on the barbecue for 100 years. The blackened tip then crumbled and fell to the floor as dust. Ever since he was a young man, Grandpa had prided himself on looking immaculate, even in a nurse's uniform. But the double-breasted blazer, with polished gold buttons, the RF tie, the neatly pressed grey slacks, all amounted to nothing if his moustache wasn't perfectly twizzled. For Grandpa, for one end of his moustache to be burned off was treason. The fury he felt gave the old man an almost superhuman surge of strength. He forced the woman's arm back towards her. "Squadron leader, grab that bedpan, quick!" he ordered. Jack picked up the porcelain pot from the floor and in his confusion went to offer it to Mrs. Trifle. "Thank you, dear," said the old lady. "It's not ideal, but if I can aim straight, I can make do." "No, squadron leader, use it on the commandant." Matron spun around just as the boy lifted the bedpan above his head and crashed it down on hers. Smash! The pot exploded into hundreds of tiny pieces. "Well, thank you very much," complained Mrs. Trifle. "I was all ready to go." The three looked down at the evil woman, now lying on the carpet spread out like a starfish. "There's no time to lose," barked Grandpa. "Can I please just have my tinkle?" demanded Mrs. Trifle. "Trifle, pull yourself together, woman." "You will have to wait," Grandpa ordered. "You can't wait when you get to my age," huffed the elderly lady. "When you need to go, you need to go. Now please escort me. I thought you were gentlemen." "I am a gentleman," exclaimed Grandpa, though his gentlemanness was being tested to the limit. "Then why are you dressed like that?" the old lady inquired. "It's all part of the escape plan," snapped Grandpa. "Now please, madam, there's no time to lose. Take my arm." "Thank you, Wing Commander. My poor... what is the polite word?" She pointed to her behind. "Bottom," ventured Grandpa. "No," said Mrs. Trifle. "Bum," said the boy cheekily. "No." Mrs. Trifle was quite cross now. "I am a lady." "I was going to say posterior. My poor posterior is awfully sore after that fall. I can hardly walk in a straight line." With her arm in his, Grandpa gallantly accompanied the elderly lady down the long corridor and round the corner to the nearest lavatory. "Oh, what a gentleman! I feel like a debutante at her first society ball," blushed Mrs. Trifle. "Squadron leader," called out Grandpa. "Yes, sir?" "You keep an eye on the commandant." "Yes, sir," replied the boy with a smile. Although shaken with nerves, he was rather pleased with himself to have been the one to deliver the knockout blow to the evil Miss Swine. Jack peered down at her. The face looked strangely familiar, with those little eyes and upturned nose, but Before Jack had time to think about where he might have seen her before, Miss Swine began to flicker back to life. The bedpan had knocked her out all right, but now she was slowly coming to. First her fingers began to twitch, and then her eyes began to blink. The boy felt a deep sense of dread.